We've looked at how a series of tax measures imposed by the British Parliament angered the British colonists in America. The British colonists in America believed that without representation, without being able to vote on Parliament, Parliament should not be able to tax these British Americans in the colonies. The British Parliament also put on several other measures to anger the British colonists here. And when the Tea Act was passed and the colonists responded by dumping the tea in the harbor, the British government imposed some very harsh laws upon the colonists, sometimes called the Intolerable Acts, although in England they were called the Coercive Acts, coercion to make the colonists obey. But the colonists were in no mood to obey, especially when the port of Boston was closed down and when the Massachusetts Charter was canceled and the new Governor, General Thomas Gage, would basically be like a dictator. Now, General Gage, of course, tried to prevent a war by seizing arms and gunpowder in and around Boston, but in doing so, he actually started a war with the battles of Lexington and Concord in 1775. Now, in 1775, after the battles of Lexington and Concord, you had Benedict Arnold and Ethan Allen securing Fort Ticonderoga and taking large amounts of gunpowder and cannons from that fort. You had the invasion of Canada, which the Americans hoped to sort of use as a bargaining chip. That invasion eventually failed in December 1775, despite the best efforts of Benedict Arnold, who was wounded in that battle. The American colonists had also given the British Army heavy losses when the British Army at Boston had tried to break out of Boston in the Battle of Bunker Hill. And so at the end of 1775, the British Army was still encamped in Boston, sort of still surrounded there. Meanwhile, the American Continental Congress had met and sent the olive branch petition to the king, asking that he step in and help them against Parliament. Meanwhile, the Continental Congress had also appointed George Washington as commander of a new army to fight for the rights of Englishmen, so to speak, if that became necessary. Now, by early 1776, the British Army in Boston still surrounded. The cannons from the cannons from Fort Ticonderoga had been dragged back, and Washington ordered them placed on Dorchester Heights around Boston, which means the British supply ships could be destroyed. The British Army then retreated and left Boston to the cheers, of course, of the colonists. About the same time, we learned that the king had rejected the olive branch petition, was in the process of hiring German mercenary troops called Hessians to come to America to help put down the revolt. Meanwhile, also many Americans were reading a little pamphlet by Thomas Paine called Common Sense, listing common sense reasons to break away from England and declare independence. So with all these things happening, by the summer of 1776, Congress had decided and studied the idea of independence and come to the conclusion on July 2nd that Americans should be independent from England. 2 days later, they adopted the Declaration of Independence written by Thomas Jefferson, which stated that people have certain rights that are given to them at birth and that the government's job is to secure those rights, that we create a government to protect those rights. But since the British government was not protecting our rights, we have the right to abolish that government and create a new one, which Americans were doing. That was all well and good, but even as Americans were voting on independence and adopting the Declaration of Independence, a huge British fleet and army appeared off the New York coast. The king had, and Parliament, of course, the king had jumped on the side of Parliament. Parliament had basically decided to create an army and bring this army to America to put down this rebellion and keep the colonists in Britain. So during the summer, Britain sent 32,000 troops loaded on ships to America, including almost 10,000 German troops, Hessian troops across the Atlantic. They appointed a new British commander, General William Howe, and Howe hoped that the sheer size of his army would convince the Patriots to give up. So he was hopeful that when this huge army and fleet appeared off New York, the colonists would simply go, oh, we made a mistake, we better stay in England. And even if that was not the case, Howe was very hopeful that this huge British army would basically destroy the rebellion in one decisive blow. The colonists decided not to be awed by this might of power. In fact, several colonists believed, what sort of government would, use all of its power, use all of its money, would use, create and bring all of its army to basically crush the hopes and dreams of these people. And so in some American quarters, and some Americans, this simply created a better desire, a higher desire for independence. It didn't actually sort of scare them. It simply made them matter. But nevertheless, the new Continental Army, the new army that was gathering around George Washington, was still training, had not been completed yet, but still he rushed to defend New York with his almost 20,000 half-trained troops. But unfortunately, the coastline, the British Navy, could basically land troops anywhere, which means Washington sort of had to spread his troops out, including he had to cover several landing places along Long Island. And the British had basically stopped at Staten Island and had offloaded its troops for several weeks. So those troops who had spent a month getting here by sea could basically recover their health from that sea trip, and soon many of those British troops would be put into action against Washington.
21st.
An
American spy reports to Washington that Lower Long Island, what is now Brooklyn, will be the first target of the British. Washington rushes in reinforcements.
But we immediately start fortifying our positions. Fear is a great inspiration for hard work. I have my gun, canteen, knapsack, and a blanket. It's my first battle. Will I be able to kill someone else?
The next morning, under cover of the formidable guns of the British Navy, 15,000 British troops land unopposed at the southern tip of Long Island. Waiting behind defensive barricades 3 miles away are the Americans. They are outnumbered 2 to 1. The British regiments, in dense formation, march up the open fields toward the heights. Their plan? To crush the rebellion in one decisive battle.
The British advance to within about 300 yards of us and begin a very heavy fire. Bullets and shells fly very fast, now and then taking off ahead.
It's very, very difficult to reconstruct these extraordinary battles of the past. But they did indeed form up in dense ranks, very carefully ordered. They did march up to within musket shot of each other with the officers in front. And they did fire at each other at very close range indeed. A man firing at another 100 yards away had almost no chance of hitting him. The ball might go anywhere. So the only way you could be certain of inflicting casualties on the enemy was to mass your men as closely as possible together. So both sides formed up into compact clumps and fired at each other, each hoping that the other would run away.
Once you would have loaded for the first volley, fired your first volley, returned your musket and reloaded, the noise was such that there was no hearing anything. You couldn't hear commands. You'd be very lucky if you could hear a drum beat, for instance, which was one of the reasons they used drums for various commands once the volleying started. But it was then fire at will. and you just kept firing until you heard either a drum beat or somebody yelling in your ear, cease fire, cease fire. There was no organization after about the third volley.
The Patriots hold the high ground. They shoot down on the advancing enemy soldiers. The British realize that they must change tactics or suffer heavy casualties.
Howe was a professional. When he came over with his troops, he immediately sent out his light dragoons to scout the territory. He also had some local Tories that were guiding him, and they found out that the passway over on the American left was virtually unguarded. The Americans, not knowing any topography, they just slipped up, and they left the Jamaica Pass unguarded.
With half their forces in the front, keeping the Americans occupied, a division of 10,000 British soldiers marches undetected through the Jamaica Pass to a position behind the American lines.
Our men stand amazingly well until 12 o'clock, when the main party of British, by a route we never dreamt of, surround us.
Suddenly they looked around, and here was Howe's army coming up behind them. Here was Howe's army coming up on the side. They had to control the line. Which way could they fire? They simply broke and they ran.
The Americans have only one escape route, through the Gowanus Marsh. The British slaughter the fleeing soldiers.
I can't describe the confusion and the horror of the scene. Artillery flying, our men running in every direction, and everywhere we turn, we meet the British or the Hessians. Men up to their knees in mud, screaming for help. Everyone else running to save their own skins.
It was a catastrophe. And partly it's American amateurism at fighting this kind of big battle. They never fought a battle on that scale before. They never had an organization that was designed to fight that kind of battle before. This is new, and they got clobbered.
The rebels have courage, but British discipline wins the day. They're raw troops, never seen action before. Their officers have no understanding of the strategies of war. The Maryland soldiers were from the best families in the province. They were heroes, cut down in the bloom of their youth. The pursuit and slaughter lasted for many hours.
At that moment, in late August of 1776, it really looks as if you're going to lose the war in the first battle, just as the British commanders had predicted you would. British planning is based on the idea of one big decisive battle, and this looks like it, the Battle of Long Island.
The Americans have retreated to Brooklyn Heights. Facing them is the British Army. At their backs is the East River. Almost the entire Continental Army is trapped. The British wait for Washington to surrender.
In the 18th century, in European warfare, it wasn't just a question of winning, but it was also a question of how you won. In a way, it was better to lose well than to win badly. That was they thought the form and ritual of warfare was very important, and wished to behave like gentlemen at all times.
According to the gentlemanly rules of warfare, Washington should concede defeat. Instead, when night falls and a thick fog blankets the East River, he orders his troops to keep all their campfires burning. Then, quietly, he begins to ferry men, horses, and cannon back to Manhattan, a few boatloads at a time. By morning, the entire American army has crossed over to New York.
And the British finally discovered that the fortifications were no longer occupied.
All right. So George Washington succeeds in saving the bulk of the new Continental Army against the British. So the Battle of Long Island in August of 1776, 20,000 British soldiers defeated Washington's army of 10,000. And although it looked like Washington's army was trapped and would have to surrender, the American army secretly rowed across to Manhattan Island under cover of fog. But of course, the British army is not just going to stay on Long Island. They're going to invade New York, and so there are going to be more battles. And basically, as the American army moves to the Manhattan Island, it moves to Harlem Heights. The British follow Washington there, and there in another battle, Washington's army is defeated again. Washington's army retreats to White Plains, New York, where the British army follows him again. Again, Washington's army is defeated. Washington then retreats to the other side of the river at Fort Washington and Fort Lee. The British army follow, and in another battle, Washington's army is defeated again. So Washington loses 4 battles against the British army that has just landed. Of course, his previous record in the French and Indian War was 0-2, and now, if you want to add those 4 losses, his record is 0-6. So his retreat continues through New Jersey in September, October, and November. There might have been some more battles, except Washington's army is running away so fast, the British army couldn't catch up to it to actually fight it. Eventually, what was left of Washington's army crossed the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, and as it crossed, it basically took all the small boats with it. So even if the British army had wanted to follow Washington's army into Pennsylvania, basically there were no more boats to take over the river, and so for a time, Washington's army was safe. Unfortunately, what had started off with almost 20,000 Continental troops was now down to 5,000 Continental troops. And basically, the British believed the war was over. They basically believed that during this winter time that the rest of the few thousand troops Washington had would basically just go home, and come spring, the war would be over. And it's true that even at this point, there are people in New Jersey swearing loyalty to the king again, saying, "Oh no, I wasn't a rebel. You know, I love being part of the British Empire. I love the king. God save the queen and all that, and king and queen and all that good stuff." So basically, General Howe basically withdrew his army to New York City, and in New York, in order to find some nice towns to stay in that were comfortable and heated during the winter of 1776 and early 1777. But just in case Washington's army was not going to starve and die, the British generals did leave sort of a tripwire. They left sort of an alarm system. They left some German troops along a few towns along the Delaware River, just in case Washington decides to attack. These troops at a place called, for example, Trenton in New Jersey, would alert the British main army in New York, and then the British main army could quickly swoop down and destroy Washington. But of course, basically the British general didn't expect any of that to happen. They simply expected Washington's army to basically die. Meanwhile, of course, Washington was sort of, didn't have much options left with his troops, and many of those troops, their terms were going to expire starting in January of 1777. So at this point in the war, most troops basically signed on for a certain amount of combat, either 60 days, 90 days, or sometimes even a year. And many of Washington's troops, their terms would expire at midnight on December 31st. But Washington was not going to give up. He decides to use whatever troops he has for one last attack, one last chance to save the American Revolutionary War. So Washington basically decides to divide his three forces up, his 5,000 men up into three forces. Each of these forces, about 1,500 men, would about sort of cross the river to different place using their small boats, and then they would all converge on this German Hessian outpost at Trenton and attack it. So he realized his troops might be staying and fighting for a little bit longer than their terms, so he pleaded with them to stay until the job was done, and the troops basically said, yes, we'll stay, and we'll fight until we can fight no longer, until we see that the war's over, and then we'll go home. But nevertheless, the troops decided to sort of extend their term, at least for a couple of weeks. So on the night of December 25th and 26th, 1776, Washington and about 2,400 men crossed the Delaware River. And there's a very famous painting showing Washington crossing the Delaware. Of course, there's the river was very wide. These were not exactly the type of boats Washington had, and that's because the artist that did this painting was not along for the ride. The painting was done many years later, but there were huge chunks of floating ice in the river, and the river was at flood stage, so it was a dangerous crossing regardless. And at that point, so even though the picture is very romantic, and as far as oh, look, Washington's crossing the Delaware, there he is standing up in the boat. Nobody was standing up in these boats. The river current was too tough. If you stood up on the boat, not only were you going to get tossed in the river, but probably the boat was going to tip over and everybody else was going to get tossed in the river as well. So the boats, which were basically flat-bottom boats, everyone was sitting down and hoping that they would actually get across, which they did. They then started to proceed to Trenton and started to march to Trenton. There were some people out that evening, and one of them saw Washington's forces and raced to Trenton and basically told one of the German soldiers on duty what was happening, and wrote down a message saying, hey, it looks like a large number of American troops are headed this way. And the German soldier then took that message to the German general who was playing poker at the time. And of course, most of his men had been celebrating Christmas by drinking intoxicating beverages, that is. So many of his men were in their bunks and sleeping it off, and Raoul himself was in a poker game, and so he was brought this message by the British sentry, and Raoul simply, busy playing cards and having fun, he simply stuck the paper in his pocket and didn't even read it. Shortly thereafter, as the sort of the dawn broke, Washington, who had brought a small cannon, had basically sort of arrived at Trenton, which had one big main street at the time, and focused the cannon down the main street, and then his soldiers started to attack. Naturally, the German troops, once they realized their attack, they came pouring out of the buildings they were staying in, and at that point, the cannon, which was basically not firing cannonballs, but sort of small objects that sort of did maximum damage, was basically mowing down or injuring many German soldiers at once, all at a time. Meanwhile, there was hand-to-hand fighting going on, but within just a few minutes, within 30 minutes or so, the 1,500 German soldiers at Trenton were either dead, wounded, or captured. General Rahl himself had been wounded, and he died that day, and that's when the Americans who searched his clothes found the note that he had never opened. So that was a tremendous victory for the Americans. A small victory, but it was a victory. However, very quickly, the British couriers raced to the main British army, and 6,000 British soldiers quickly moved down from New York under the command of General Cornwallis. And within just a day or so had arrived at Trenton. So Washington's troops who were sort of celebrating were now sort of trapped. They were trapped between the British Army that was sort of outside of town and the bank of the river, which of course was flood stage. And it looked like Washington was going to have to do battle the next day, and his men would be crushed by this huge British army. But during the night, Washington and his men, they left the campfires burning, and they left a few men to work on the campfires to make it seem like the American army was still there. And even the British sentries were fooled. They were looking out and they saw the campfires burning, and many of them urged General Cornwallis to attack immediately, even though it was getting nighttime. And General Cornwallis, who had marched his troops all day to get there, said, no, our British troops are very tired. If they fight now, they might not win. So we'll just wait till tomorrow morning and we'll finish off the old fox. The old fox is what he called George Washington. But what he didn't know was, even as he was speaking, George Washington, most of George Washington's army was sneaking out along a trail by the river that the British army never even knew about. So the next morning, the British army woke up to do battle, but Washington and his army were not there. Where they were a few miles down the road, where they met near a town called Princeton, 1,200 British troops coming to reinforce the main British army. Washington and his basically 1,500 men smashed into this reinforcement column and basically killed or wounded many British soldiers. The other British soldiers ran away. They did capture some money. The British soldiers were also taken to Cornwallis. And so within a week, Washington won two quick and important victories, the Battle of Trenton and the Battle of Princeton. And after winning the Battle of Princeton, he went down to where the boats actually were on the river and sailed, and basically didn't sail, he rowed back, had his men row back across the Delaware River into Pennsylvania, where they were now safe. Meanwhile, the British, of course, were somewhat confounded that this had happened. It was still wintertime, and so most of the main British army sort of pulled back towards New York. Eventually, Washington comes back, and he basically goes into the hills in New Jersey and camps in what's called Morristown, and has a winter camp. So the British, who thought they were going to win the war in one quick big battle, did not. They had thought that Washington's army was going to die during the winter, and it didn't. And that means in 1777, the British army is going to have to fight again. They're going to have to try to find some other way to crush this rebellion. So 1777 brings a new concern for the British government. This rebellion has not been crushed, because the longer the war goes on, the less certain you are to win it. The longer a war goes on, the more bad things that could happen to your troops, especially when your troops are 3,500 miles away from you by sea, as America was from England. And you never knew what could happen in the war. So the main British plan in 1776 had been to crush the rebellion in one big blow, but that had not worked. And so now the British have to come up with a new plan. And basically this new plan, their plan was to cut off New England from the rest of the colonies. So up until this point, really, the British really believed that it was New England that had been infected by this sort of disease, that said, hate the British, hate the king, hate Parliament. And the British government really believed that most Americans in the middle colonies and most Americans in the southern colonies were still loyal British citizens. And so they hoped that by splitting off New England from the rest of the colonies, that basically one or two things would happen. One, that basically George Washington's army would be forced to give up, and because it would be, the colonies would be split in two. But even if that didn't happen, at least the middle colonies and southern colonies would still be brought back under British control, and eventually the British army could sort of gobble up or destroy what was left of New England later on. Now, to do this, the British government was going to separate New England from the rest of the colonies by attacking Albany, New York. And Albany, New York was sort of a major city which connected sort of the middle colonies with New England. And to do this, 3 different armies would converge on Albany. one British army of about 15,000 troops would leave New York. This is the main British army, would leave New York and basically go up the Hudson River, basically past American forts, and arrive at Albany. Meanwhile, another British army of about 8,000 men, 8,000 redcoats, would come down the St. Lawrence River, would sail down Lake Champlain, would recapture Fort Ticonderoga, then would march overland about 80 or 90 miles and arrive at Albany. Meanwhile, another British army of 1,000 British soldiers and 1,000 loyal Indian allies would basically come down the Mohawk River, come in basically and attack Albany from the west. So 3 British armies basically arriving in Albany all at the same time would crush any American resistance, would capture Albany, and split off New England from the rest of the colony. That was their plan in 1777. So to see if it works, here we have a nice map, but you might notice that the map at the bottom, you might notice what sort of looks like the red X, which represents the main British army in New York. It's not going north. It's going southwest. So the British General Howe, decides he thinks this would be a great time to capture Philadelphia, which is then serving as the American capital city. So back in Europe, if you capture an enemy's capital city, you win the war. So General Howe just assumes if he captures Philadelphia, he'll win the war. But besides which, Howe believes he can go to Philadelphia, capture Philadelphia, and still be back in Albany when he's supposed to. And maybe he could have, but one thing that postponed him was the weather. So the British fleet were going to take these troops. He could have marched overland from New York to Philadelphia, but Washington's army was somewhere out there. And the last thing you wanted to do was basically sort of line out your troops in many, many miles with all those supply wagons along a one narrow road and have an enemy army come and crush your supply wagons, which means your army is going to be without food and supplies, which means your army is going to have to surrender. So no British general of the 1800s or the 1700s is going to take that risk. So instead, General Howe is going to load his troops onto ships and sail them to Philadelphia. Unfortunately, just the time as he's loading his men, a storm comes up and it delays his sailing by a couple of weeks. So by the time he actually arrives near Philadelphia and offloads his troops, guess who's there waiting for him? If you guessed George Washington, you are correct. Nevertheless, the British have a little bit more troops than Washington. Washington stations his troops along a river in front of Philadelphia called Brandywine Creek and prepares for battle. The British troops, half of them attack Washington's troop along the river. The other half sort of slide away and come up from behind. They go around Washington's army, just like they had done at the Battle of Long Island, which Washington lost. And this time as well, as the British troops come up from behind the American forces, despite the army fighting much better this time, the American army has to retreat. Washington loses another battle, and the British basically march into Philadelphia. But Washington's not prone to give up, because by this time, because his army has lasted through the winter, more patriots, more people who want independence from England have now joined his army. So his 5,000 men have transformed into at least 11,000 men. So he's not going to just sort of give up. He's going to try to fight the British army again. And General Howe gives him an opportunity. Howe leaves about 5,000 men in Philadelphia and takes another 10,000 men to a place called Germantown, which had been started by, you guessed it, the Germans many years earlier. And the British army was hoping to find food and supplies at Germantown to help them last the winter in Philadelphia. So as the British troops arrive in Germantown, Washington has a master plan for basically destroying this British army. And it's a brilliant plan. It really is. He divides his troops into 4 groups. Each group will attack the British army from a different direction at a different time, and the British army will be so confused it'll give up. And it was a brilliant plan, but when the day of the battle came, there was one army that was very confused. but it was not the British Army. It was George Washington's army. So one of the groups attacked at the right place, but at the wrong time. Another attacked at the right time, but at the wrong place. Another group simply got lost and never attacked. And so at the end, the British had secured another victory against Washington's army, which, of course, if you're counting, brings his record up to 8-2. I'm sorry, excuse me, 2-8. He won Trenton and Princeton with his other record at the French and Indian War, and his 4 losses and 2 more, 4, 6, 7, 8. So basically, all together, he's now like 2-8, which is not really a good record. And so you might consider Washington a loser at this point, but no, he's actually a winner. Why is he a winner? Because the British Army is in Philadelphia. It's not in Albany where it's supposed to be. That is, all this time, Howe has been marching his army to Philadelphia and marching his army around Washington and fighting. He's not been going to Albany. And so by this time, it's getting later in the year, and Howe just decides to stay in Philadelphia, and he decides not even to try to go to Albany. Even worse, he doesn't tell anyone he's not going to Albany. He just sits in Philadelphia, basically having a nice old time. Of course, the Continental Congress has already run away from Philadelphia, but of course, Philadelphia is basically the biggest city in the colonies at the time. And so General Howe is basically sort of feeling like, oh, look, I'm almost back in England. I'm back in the civilized city. And so he's going to sit out the war in Philadelphia. Of course, there are still 2 armies going to Albany. So as you can see on the map there, there's a series of arrows that go round and round. It's no wonder the Continental Army was confused and lost a couple times and lost the city of Philadelphia. Meanwhile, General St. Leger's army of 1,000 British troops and 1,000 loyal Indians got as far as Fort Stanwix. So on this map, you can see as they're coming in from the west, they get to Fort Stanwix, where there are a couple of hundred Americans. The British troops and their Indian allies basically surround the force and basically wait for the fort to surrender, and then they'll move down the Mohawk River and basically arrive at Albany. Meanwhile, in rides our hero. No, not George Washington yet. Remember, his record's not quite that good. In rides our hero, Benedict Arnold, the hero of Fort Ticonderoga, the man who risked his life at Quebec trying to capture that force. So Benedict Arnold raises a force to come rescue the Americans at Fort Stanwix. But Benedict Arnold's force is still not as large as the British Army, even though it's about 500 men. So Benedict Arnold decides on some psychological warfare. And the psychological warfare is he basically takes someone who claims to be a loyalist, someone who claims to be loyal to the king, but is really loyal to the American forces, who's really a patriot. And he basically has this man beat up, so the man looks like he's been in a fight. And then this loyalist makes his way into St. Leger's camp. And as he comes in, he basically, this loyalist, he basically tells this story. And it's a terrible story. And it's a terrible story about how this man and his loyalist militia units have been fighting this huge American army. And now this huge American army has destroyed everybody. This huge American army under the command of Benedict Arnold has destroyed and killed everybody that had been fighting against us except for this one loyalist. And now this loyalist has come to warn St. Leger. And this loyalist says, this huge American army, they must have 10,000 men and they're coming this way. And the Indians go, what? What? The Americans have 10,000 men? I think we have business somewhere else. Bye. And so the loyal Indians, the loyal British Indians, run away. So now Leger has 1,000 men, and although he doesn't believe Arnold has 10,000 men, he is sort of convinced that maybe Arnold has a lot more than his 1,000-man army can handle. So St. Leger decides to turn around and go back to Canada. But he never tells anyone he's turning around and going back to Canada. Meanwhile, 8,000 redcoats or so are marching from Canada, sailing down Lake Champlain. They stop off at Fort Ticonderoga. They, within a couple of days, they capture the fort. And now all they basically have to do is march overland to capture Albany. And as the British forces march, you know, they brought, by the way, a lot of supplies with them, because once they get in Albany, General Burgoyne realizes that, you know, he thinks the war is going to be over, and he'll be, you know, basically a hero, and he's going to be in Albany for a while, and he's going to. So he brought all of his china, he brought all of his, he brought his liquor and his champagne collection. He brought a lot of stuff. So there's not only supplies like ammunition, there's a long line of these wagons that are carrying all these supplies for the British Army as they march south. Now, the Americans are sort of gathering steam, but it's really not until some nice Indians, some loyal Indians of the British Army, they're sort of scouting in front of Burgoyne, and these British Indians, I'll call them, they're not really British, they're loyal Indians, they're Indians loyal to the British Army, because at this point, many Indians figure that if the Americans ever win, the Americans will just take over all the Indian lands. At least with the British government, at least the British government might protect some of their lands. So many Indians have sided with the British. And so these Indians who are loyal to the British, as they're scouting, they run across some farms on the frontier, and they basically kill the people in the frontier farms, including some women and children. And this really angers the Americans in the area. And so even some Americans who might not have turned out for the battle, when they hear that you know, these women and children have been killed, they rush to join the militia. And so as Burgoyne is approaching Albany at a pretty quick pace. However, the American general involved decides to start, General Gates decides to send out some forces and start cutting down some trees, start trying to delay General Burgoyne. So American men go out with the axe and start chopping down trees, because there's only one road, there's only one trail basically from Ticonderoga to Albany, and now this trail is basically littered with trees, which means the British Army has to stop, move the trees, move on, stop, move the trees, move on, stop, move the trees, move on. So by the time they're approaching Albany, this army, Burgoyne's army, about 8,000 redcoats, they're moving at about 1 mile a day, which is really, really slow. And that gives the Americans time to sort of gather up their forces. The British, realizing they're sort of facing a larger American force and sort of running out of supplies, they send one group of about 1,000 British redcoats out to the east to see if they can find some supplies. But this group basically runs into militia company and is basically almost wiped out. So Burgoyne is somewhat worried by now, but still he has, you know, almost 7,500 redcoats left, and he decides to tries to push through the main American army to reach Albany. So as the battle begins, it looks like the redcoats are pushing the American army back, but in rides our hero again, not George Washington, Benedict Arnold. Arnold has returned from rescuing Fort Stanwix and forcing one British army to retreat, and now he arrives back, and even though the main general, General Gates, orders Benedict Arnold not to interfere, basically because Gates wants all the credit. Gates is, you know, sensing an American victory, so General Gates wants to be the commander. He wants to be the guy who beat the British army, and he orders Benedict Arnold not to do anything. But Benedict Arnold gets on his horse, and as the British army is basically pushing the American army back, Benedict Arnold rides between the two armies. The British are on one side, about 100 yards away from the Americans who are on the other side. They're both shooting at each other. And here's Benedict Arnold on his horse riding back and forth, and he's encouraging his men, men, don't retreat, no, follow me to victory. And it works, because the Americans stop retreating, and they start moving forward again. But at this point, Benedict Arnold is shot off, the horse is shot, and Benedict Arnold falls with his horse, and the horse falls on Benedict Arnold's leg, the same leg that had been wounded at the Battle of Quebec. But nevertheless, basically, Benedict Arnold pushes off the horse and basically, you know, gathers the troops, and the troops push through Benedict Arnold and basically push the British army back to where it had been. Eventually, Benedict Arnold is taken off the field to receive medical attention. But now, the main British army under Burgoyne is sort of trapped. But he doesn't worry because he says, don't worry, men. You know, at any moment, General St. Leger will be coming in from the west to rescue us. And just about then, a courier rides in, a horseman rides in with a message from basically General St. Leger saying, oh, I'm sorry, I'm back in Canada. Can't help you out. But Burgoyne says, don't worry, men. It only seems like we're trapped. You know, right this minute, General Howe with 15,000 men is probably just a few miles away to rescue us. And at this point, another little courier comes in and basically with a note saying, from General Howe saying, oh, by the way, I captured Philadelphia and I'm staying here this winter, so I won't be in Albany to see you. Bye. So in October, basically with surrounded by American troops, with no help coming, Burgoyne surrenders his entire army to the Americans on October 17, 1777 at Saratoga, New York. It's a great victory for the Americans. They've captured an entire British army, and it's greater than you think, because all this time, Ben Franklin and some other Americans have been in France, who happens to be the enemy of England. And the Americans, Benjamin Franklin, had been trying to convince the French king to join the war on the American side. Because all these years, ever since the end of the French and Indian War, ever since England had basically taken over all of New France and had forced the French to leave America, there had been one word on the mind of many Frenchmen, one word on the lips of many Frenchmen, and that word starts with an R. Revenge. Revenge. And so when the American Revolutionary War starts in France, it's a good time to be French, because you're reading the newspapers and you're reading about how these Americans at Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill, look, the British are killing the British. They're killing each other. Isn't this great? Oh, what could be better than the British killing each other? Oh, well, there could be one thing. What if America was ripped away from Britain, just like New France had been ripped away from the French? That would be revenge. So the French had wanted to come in on the war on the American side, but they had to be careful. I mean, what happens if the French agreed to come in on the war on the American side and they sent over this huge French army to help the Americans, and when the French army arrives, the Americans have already surrendered to the British. And this French army arrives and says, hey, we're here to help you, and oh, I'm sorry, we're all British and your French army is now captured. So the French had to be very careful. They had to make sure that the Americans stood a chance of winning before they would help the Americans out. They had to make sure the Americans were in this for the long haul. They had to make sure the Americans wouldn't just give up. And the Battle of Saratoga is the proof that Americans are in this war to win their independence. They're not just going to give up. And when the news of Saratoga arrives in France, France joins the war on the American side. Famous painting of General Burgoyne surrendering to the American general at Saratoga. After the Battle of Saratoga, it showed the French that Americans had a chance of winning if they had help. The French entered the war on the American side. The French would eventually supply the American army with so many supplies, with gunpowder, with weapons, with cannons, with medical supplies. They'd send over a large army. They'd send over a large fleet. And really, we probably would not have our independence without that French aid. So, of course, with France in the war, that means the Revolutionary War had turned into another world war for the British. Which is somewhat ironic, because remember, all this had started when Parliament tried to pay off the last World War, when they had tried to pay off the French and Indian War, the 7 Years' War, which they had won, but they had tried to pay it off by taxing the Americans. And now what had their actions done? They had started a completely new war between France and all of its friends around the world versus the British and all of their friends around the world. And so now this, basically what had been a sort of civil war between the British, a war now for American independence, had turned into sort of a world war. With the French and the Americans on the same side.